Beste kijker van de Nieuwe Wereld. Als uitzendingen als deze je bevallen, steun ons dan. Met een kleine bijdrage of een grote gift. Dit is onze eindejaarsactie en we hebben jullie nu nodig. Als je door het jaar heen wil helpen, kies dan voor een bijdrage via Petje Af. Dat kan het hele jaar door, elke maand. Dank. Welkom bij de Nieuwe Wereld, verdiepende gesprekken in een tijd van verandering. Mijn naam is Jelle van Baardewijk en vandaag maak ik een Engelstalige uitzending met de Duitse filosoof Hanno Sauer die in Nederland werkt. So, I will now continue in English and I hope you will join us. We will be discussing morality.
That's right.
You, as a philosopher, wrote a book
on
morality. It's kind of a typical German book, huh?
I guess so. Why? What makes you say that?
Yeah, well, morality from prehistory.
Yeah. To polarization.
To polarization, huh?
Yeah.
From prehistorie bis zum Gegenwart.
Yeah.
A typical German angle, like wanting to describe the whole history.
It's a big swing, yeah. It's a big swing. So I try to tell a long story and a big story, and I wanted to have that grand narrative and then like an ambitious arch to the whole story. So I don't know if that's quintessentially German, but it's true that that's what I tried to do, and I hope it worked out.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed the book. What can we learn from it? Well, we hope to discuss that. But one of the interesting aspects of your book, I think, is that you have a, so to say, although you wouldn't describe it yourself in these terms, a layered conception of morality, yeah? Like an archaeology of morality.
Yeah.
So you discern several layers, the oerlaag, and then it builds up to this day and age.
Yeah, that's a good way of describing it, a layered conception of morality. I don't think morality is one thing. I don't think we get our moral norms and values and principles from divine inspiration. We don't get it from a priori, pure reasoning. We don't get it from just our emotional reactions. These are all secondary, I think. We get it from a historical process that gives us layers of different solutions to different problems. Much of them are problems that arise out of the fact that we are social beings who live together, who depend on one another for protection, sharing resources, sharing information, coming up with rules and conventions and norms to organize our social lives. I like to call that our normative infrastructure. So the infrastructure of norms and values that we build to organize the way we live together. And that's not something that comes into existence in one go, but it has different steps of evolution and transformation. Some of them are biological evolution, some of them are cultural evolution, some of them are just social evolution, just history, more recently. And they are layered on top of one another. And they start with, very basic things such as where does cooperation and living and working together come from in the first place? And then on top of that, we have built structures to deal with challenges that confront us from a changing volatile environment, from changing technology, political structures, economic growth, and so on. And our normative infrastructure responds to these changes and tries to integrate them. And it's supposed to be functional overall. And I think that's basically the perspective that I'm taking, is to articulate the logic of these different layers of morality and see what kinds of problems they solve and what kind of problems they maybe didn't solve so well.
Yeah. Okay, so before we dive into this layered structure, this normative infrastructure, as you call it, to start with where we are now at the moment, what do you consider to be moral? And I also ask it because morality is itself a contested notion, due to woke and perhaps also anti-woke, but also against the horizon of your book, that morality overlaps with, you could say, civilization, with processes of normalization.
Yeah,
that I think many people wouldn't call moral, but more like civic virtues or like modern behavior. So what is morality? And what do you think that we can agree on?
Yeah.
Especially considering that
Yeah.
it's such a contested notion.
Exactly. I mean, if you're asking me for a definition of morality,
Well, a description.
then I'm reluctant to give it because I think definitions are usually not very useful. They're either false or trivial, right? So either they're don't capture the meaning of the concept that we want to define, or if they do capture it, they are trivial because we already need to know the meaning, so it just articulates what we already know. And I think that defining morality is especially difficult because Nietzsche once said that you can't define anything that has a history, right? So something that is the result of a contested, fragmented, historical process that was not directed by deliberate design, and that was not carefully carved out to be a specific thing and one specific thing only. Anything that's like that will be difficult to define, and I think morality is very much like that. It's a very unruly phenomenon with many different
That's already
aspects.
very interesting,
Yeah.
because philosophers tend to think in analytic tradition,
Yeah.
which is not mine, not at all. But they also did find the right name for their own
Yes.
endeavor, because they call themselves analytic. And there's of course some truth in that. The good philosopher should also be analytic.
That's correct. Yeah.
In a small definition, one finds the idea that morality is something that can be described as morality, that has to do with our conscientiousness, that is ruled by its own literally rules.
Yeah.
And you don't have to become a Kantian or a utilitarian to
Exactly.
to take in that position.
Yeah.
But if I understand you correctly, you say, well, that's the wrong idea of morality, because it's something that is historically grown.
Yeah.
So it's not its own realm that can be separated from the social or the psychological realm. It's something that has grown, has its own vulnerabilities, paradoxes.
Exactly. I think,
and this is very interesting for a philosopher, because most would disagree with you.
Yeah, well, I guess mainstream philosophy in the Anglophone world, as it has been practiced, especially in the second half of the 20th century and until now, would stress more the importance of analyzing concepts and making philosophical progress that way. I don't think that's very useful. Being analytic is useful, being clear and rigorous and introducing interesting and illuminating distinctions. That's all fine, and we need that for sure. But I think we're not going to get much knowledge about what morality is and how it works from sitting in our armchair and reflecting about the concept of morality. We need to look into the real world. Morality is not a thing that's in our heads. Morality is not a thing that really can be that usefully understood and described and accounted for and explained by looking at individual people. It's not a thing where people have a rule book and then they see whether the things that they are inclined to do conform to that rule book or not. It's not a thing where people have a calculus of what's the best outcome and then they kind of check whether the thing that they find themselves inclined to do conforms to that calculus. That's not really how morality works. It couldn't work this way, even. What morality really is one way of putting it at least, is it's a big part of our extended mind. And our extended mind is the overarching supra-individual, so above the individual, social, cultural, institutional realm of the rules and values and practices and institutions that we think are particularly important for organizing social lives, that have a particular non-arbitrariness to them, right? We all know some rules are very important. For instance, you have to drive on the right side of the street. It's very important not to drive on the left side of the street, right? But whether it's right or left is not so important. It just has to be one of the two, right? So that's an important rule, but it's just a conventional rule because there's nothing substantial hanging on, am I driving on the right side or the left side? It just has to be everyone's on the same side.
And you're claiming that morality actually
so morality is not
has the nature of these types of rules.
Morality is not conventional. That's precisely the difference. There are some other rules which we don't think are where we don't think it's optional in the same way whether we drive on the left side or the right side, but there is a particular type of conduct that is felt to be more binding and authoritative and less arbitrary and not optional. So it does matter which side of the road you're driving on in this analogy, and that's the part of our extended mind, the social, cultural, and institutional rules and regulations and practices.
Why do you call this extended mind?
Extended mind is a concept that that people have introduced in the philosophy of mind to understand how much of our, especially human mind, the functionality of our mind depends on the possibility for individual agents to avail themselves of their environment to perform certain operations, right? So the famous example is a notebook or an iPhone that scaffolds and externally supports much of your internal cognition. So it is part of your memory. That's the idea. And likewise, so the mind isn't in the head. It's partly, constituted by operations that are done by the mind, but it's really extremely dependent for functioning the way it does on a very high level for an urban environment, an informational environment, a media environment, an institutional environment with markets and corporations and universities and so on. That's our mind. It's in a way, it's a very Hegelian idea, right? It's a very, it's a very Hegelian idea in that. It's not an abstract thing that resides in people's, ethereal thoughts only, but it's a real thing that you can touch.
Yeah, but if you argue that conventions and morality institutions are actually parts of the extended mind,
yes,
it's in a way it's already a very liberal account of what a human being is.
Very liberal,
very in the sense of very individualistic.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's supposed to be the opposite.
Yeah, so institutions supporting the individual, whereas if you use notions as Sittlichkeit, as Hegel, or the idea of a common sense, then it's already not so much in the head. And perhaps that's also one of my hesitations with the notion that mind is, a human person is of course also embodied.
Yeah.
And so it's not only the mind that is important, especially in ethical questions. The body,
of course. I mean the whole
important.
thing.
So that's why I was trying to understand why you use this notion. But I do see the history in this typical way of doing philosophy from the perspective of the philosophy of mind. But let's continue a little bit. But not before that I say something about that we are here currently at. Coming close to the end of the year, and we have a GoFundMe deal, so you can support us. These type of conversations. This one is in English. Let me know if you like it, and you can support us by paying some money, €4, maybe €40. Just as a reminder, if you read the Volkskrant or NRC, you pay €40 roughly per month. So maybe you can pay us something like that if you are able to. If you're not able to, that's not a problem. We make this for everyone. So you don't really get something from us, maybe an ad-free conversation. But what's an ad-free conversation? So you pay also for other people to look at this kind of content. So if you can miss some money, please help us, support us, and enjoy these type of conversations and read the books that we reveal to you, like this one, Morality by Hanno Sauer. Okay, so morality is not something in the mind. I fully agree with it. So you shouldn't understand it subjectively.
Yeah.
You write about the normative infrastructure that is historically layered. So in other words, there is not a reign of morality. No, it's something that is constructed throughout history. Yeah. Social process, a psychological process. Before we dive into that, just one question. I mean, there is something like a self-morality, isn't there? Like the moral view on yourself.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
That perhaps that morality is not only dealing with questions of, for instance, is this society equally organized between me and you? Mm-hmm. But also, how am I living? Do I maybe aspire to be living in a different way? How do I perceive myself? Mm-hmm. How do I set certain goals? And then normative goals, like I want to be a good father, or I want to be a good friend, or I want to pursue a career, but I do want to write interesting things. You know this dilemma in academia. You of course make a career if you write a lot, but then maybe it's boring. So you want to write interesting things. And I consider this to be, well, these type of questions have a lot to do with yourself. Huh? So how do you look at this?
Yeah, I think of course we have a vocabulary of personal virtues that we use to articulate ideals for our own individual lives and how they are supposed to go, that express certain longer term goals that we can use to give the shorter term goals direction, right? So in a way, the longer term goals, it can be very few. Being a good father, having a certain type of excel in a certain type of career or something, maybe 4 or 5 goals, biographical goals, right? That structure the whole life. And then they give structure, almost like a pyramid, to the day-to-day activity. Or why do I need to get up today at 8 o'clock? Because, and in the end, it's structured by these personal ideals and long-term goals. And we make them resonate for us and motivationally effective for us by couching these goals in terms of personal virtues. For instance, I want to be a good friend. I want to perform well in the career that I've chosen because I think that it's a valuable pursuit, for instance, to generate knowledge about the world or to contribute to a free society and a kind of rational and open discourse in society. And these are these really big goals that give my life, or anyone's life, structure. And indeed, sometimes you meet people or encounter people that don't really seem to have these big goals, or not very clearly understood and articulated. And these people do tend to be or feel more disoriented and feel less fulfilled and feel like they live a less meaningful life, perhaps. So it's good for us personally and psychologically for our well-being to have these long-term goals. But here too, even though these are we are also individuals who navigate this normative infrastructure, and we do that in different ways depending on what that infrastructure is and what the norms and rules and regulations and values are that populate that infrastructure and give it its internal map-like character. And when we do that, it can be in the abstract that maybe we want to conform to this ideal and long-term goal of being a good friend or being a good father. But what the concrete understanding is of what that means and how you implement being a good father, that will be very different depending on the social configuration that you live in.
Of course.
Often you have these big transformations in the understanding of what it means to be a good father in 2023 or soon 24. It's very different from what it means to be a good father in the 60s, and it's very different from what it means to be a good father in different places and different times in general. There's going to be some kind of loose core, perhaps, of what that means to create a situation where your family can thrive. Perhaps that's one core understanding of what that means. Just like friendship will be, you enjoy each other's company and you benefit each other by providing insight and entertainment and so on. But still, what that means exactly will be dependent on what the rest of the normative infrastructure is like. A famous example for this is, for instance, love and how love is understood, right? Love and companionship between so let's focus on heterosexual companionship, because that's been the dominant model for, it still is the dominant model, but it's been the vastly dominant model for
the biological
for
model.
the longest time. Exactly.
So
and you see that there is a different understanding depending on what the rest of the normative infrastructure is. So a lot of people are wondering, why is it that a certain model of romantic companionship, for instance, seems to become much more prominent and culturally influential at a particular time? And of course, that's not an accident. It's not an accident, for instance, that on the one hand you have a Kantian understanding of morality in general that's very, very strongly based on the idea that we are autonomous free agents that give themselves moral laws. And at the same time, we see a kind of similar vibe, similar development in our culturally hegemonic understanding of what romantic love is, that is also basically structured by the ideal of autonomy. It's not supposed to be arranged. It's not for the benefit of the family, but it's two individuals that kind of freely, not on the basis of reason, but on the basis of affection, encounter each other and form a bond. So you have larger scale changes to our normative infrastructure that lead to certain big societal transformations. For instance, the emergence of the scientific revolution, markets, political structures that require more and more participation by individual citizens, the emergence of cities and universities and so on and so on.
We'll go into the history right now. I want to start with families, but before that, a question to those watching. Let us know what your personal ethics is, and if you think that your personal ethics is actually something that is given in the zeitgeist. So being a good father, is that actually something that you can decide for yourself, that you make your own decisions in, or is it something that is being a good father in 23 actually something that Anna would be doing it the same way as me? So is it all standardized actually? And is Onno making the right point that he's saying, well, many of the personal ethical questions have to do with deciding what you want in the long term and how to come there? Do you think this is the central dimension? Or does it perhaps have to do with other things as well? So what is your personal ethics and how do you understand it? Give us the examples and I will join the discussion. But later on. So now back to the family, because in your book you have these different layers. Well, the fundamental layer, of course, is when we in prehistory, maybe start in prehistory and then take us to this fascinating development that you describe in the 14th century, supported by the Catholic Church, of stimulating people to perceive themselves as being part of a nuclear family. So how do we get from understanding morality in that being part of a small community to understanding morality primarily as being part of a family? I know it's a big step, but also that's exactly the thing that I wanted to do by structuring the book this way and by organizing the material this way. I think one big theme, there are many themes, but one thread that runs through the whole book is the idea that human cooperation has to often solve the problem of an increasing group size. The technical term for this is sometimes used is the scalability of cooperation. Right? It's not normal for mammals to live in groups and communities and societies that consist of millions or even billions of individuals. Other mammals don't do that. Mammals?
Mammals in general, so other apes, for instance, no other mammal does it, right? And especially our closest ancestors, they live in very small groups. Chimpanzees, bonobos, they live in groups of, it varies in size, but it can be a dozen, it can be 50, it can be maybe 100 individuals, and they just don't have the ability to build larger groups, but we do. And now a large question that I wanted to answer with that book is what is the normative and institutional toolkit that enabled us to grow in size, because that has all these other effects. Once your collective brain, not the individual brain, but the collective brain where we're all wired up together, once your collective brain grows, you can come up with all kinds of amazing tricks. You can discover strange insights about the universe. You can build technologies, you can do science, you can do mathematics, but you need many people to build this stuff and to keep it alive and to transmit it from generation to generation. So
the first step, so to say, is from apes to humans. And as soon as we are humans, then we have the hunter-gatherer structure. And then starts the big layer of settling and farming. And that's roughly 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before Christ. And that's roughly the era in which we start living together in large groups. I would say from 30 to 100 plus, 1,000 plus. So, and then you have these big, the big civilizations like Athens with hundreds of thousands of people. But then we were already 5,000 years before Christ. So then we fast forwarded quite a lot. So that's so the first development, so to say, in human history is scaling up.
Yes.
Scaling up, and then using the advantages of scaling up.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. And we found different mechanisms of doing that.
Yeah.
So I have this structure where I start 5 million years ago, so that would be pre-human times, right? So we were not talking about human beings. We're talking about the last common ancestors that we had with other great apes, and then maybe the proto-humans that we don't really know precisely what they were, how they looked. We can sort of make educated guesses about what they were like.
Yeah.
But the challenges that they faced 5 million years ago, it's where I start, are sort of challenges of how do you live in an increasingly hostile environment with scarce resources and you're very, very vulnerable and exposed to being predated upon by large predators, for instance. You need to be smart, you need to be very cooperative, you need to share risks, you need to share resources, and you need to protect each other. That made us a whole different kind of ape compared to the others that stayed in the forests of Central Africa. We were sort of sequestered and separated into a savanna-like environment that's much more dangerous. And we are basically the rest of our history is basically what happens when you take some of these ape-like proto-human ancestors, put them in a very stressful, volatile and dangerous environment. That pays a very, very high premium for being increasingly social and cooperative, and that's what started our human evolution.
So that's layer one.
That's layer one. Yeah.
Is the idea that we started cooperating?
Yeah.
But still along the lines of kinship, huh? So
exactly,
we cooperating, being solidary with people that we are cooperating with, so not with everyone.
We need to identify the mechanisms that allow us to make this cooperation happen. And for the longest time, it was kind of a bit of a puzzle how you explain why is there such a thing as empathy and altruism and helping each other out, which doesn't seem to make much sense in an evolutionary framework, right? So an evolutionary framework and a theistic framework have complementary problems when it comes to explaining morality. The theistic framework basically struggles to explain why there's bad behavior, why there's evil, right? Because if you have a God
given world
that has these qualities and that created human beings, it's kind of surprising why evil agents and immoral behavior would exist, right? But it's easy to explain why good behavior would exist, right? Because that's what fundamentally is the nature of the universe, and the metaphysical foundation of the universe is a kind of goodness and a kind of structure and order to the universe. And evolutionary accounts of morality have the opposite problem. They don't struggle to explain bad behavior, right? It's sort of like the default is, of course, if life is a struggle for survival, it's always going to pay off to be ruthless and egoistic and selfish. And now all of a sudden we have this puzzle, but we do have self-sacrifice, and we do have altruism and empathy and cooperation and so on and so on. So where does that come from? And one part of the solution to that is that we can offer an explanation of at least how such a thing can be evolutionarily stable, at least in principle, because kinship structures mean that it will be evolutionarily advantageous for individuals to invest a lot in other individuals, other organisms that carry the same genes. Right? So that's why we care a lot about our kids, which is largely because they are carriers of copies of our genes, and we are the kinds of machines that were built by our genes to just make copies of them. And so
that's an evolutionary explanation.
Exactly.
So there are more explanations.
Yeah,
so
of course.
I don't think you can explain. I think you can. For instance, love is more than an evolutionary continuation.
It's more than that. It layers. We get a whole. We get basically what happens is we have a biological phenomenon of pair bonding that gets picked up by cultural interpretations as well, and gets reinforced like that. There is a biological foundation to kinship, evidently, because it's a mechanism that is deeply important in the whole animal kingdom. We are no exception to that. So there would be an evolutionary payoff to be very, very to care very, very much about how your children are doing, because we are the children of the people who cared a lot about their kids.
Yeah.
Right. And so there is a biological mechanism that gets picked up by cultural cognition and interpretation as well, and that's how you get a deeper understanding and a richer understanding of what love means, and so on and so on. But in principle, there is it's aided by a foundation in the kind of animal that we are, and that explains, for instance, the basic building blocks of altruism. Just like, for instance, we can also explain a different aspect of morality, which is reciprocity, right? Which is also plays some role in accounting for the nature of friendship, for instance. It doesn't explain the whole thing, but it's a big part of it. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. I help you today, you help me tomorrow.
These are actually the two ingredients, you could say, of the first layer of morality.
I think so.
Kinship and tit for tat.
If you want to have any morality at all in small groups, you have kinship, altruism, and direct and indirect reciprocity, and that allows the kind of human cooperation that we have observed to emerge in the first place. And then the question is, how do you build larger groups? And you need to layer other types of tools and rules and structures on top of these basic mechanisms to build larger groups. And my book tells the story of what these elements of our normative infrastructure are.
Yeah, but it's a paradoxical development in the sense that you build larger groups, but at the same time, it's a history of individualization. So this personal ethics also needs to take in space.
When paradoxically, that's the same thing.
And the development of, you can explain that, and the development of kinship on the level of of the large family, the Großfamilien of aunts and nephews and neighbors,
clans and tribes, and so on. Mm-hmm.
To the nuclear family.
Yes,
which is also actually a smaller unit.
Yes, exactly. So it's a weird irony of this development that as we figured out how to build larger and larger structures in society and to organize cooperation at a larger scale, which in particular happened over the past couple of hundreds and thousands of years, but with extreme vehemence over the past couple of 100 years. As we figured out how to organize very large-scale societies that are these days, at least bordering or already at a global scale, right, where systems of cooperation are globally connected, which also creates these global problems that we have to deal with. But as we scale up our cooperative structures and figure out how to include more people in the way that we live together,
I'm not sure whether I agree. I think that there's a strong tit for tat structure. So and there's a morality
that remains in place
of honesty. So the globalization is an economic fact, but I'm unsure whether it's a so to say kinship fact.
Well, it's not. It's not. It's precisely...
Is humanity a possibility, or is it only, so to say, a biological category? I think that it's primarily a biological. So there's a human species.
Yeah.
But morality seems to be maybe that's even the most. So maybe I would be interested in your answer. Mm-hmm. In the first layer, maybe the fact that you help each other and you scratch my back, I scratch yours. Maybe it's even more fundamental than kinship.
Yeah. Oh well, I wouldn't say so, but we don't need to decide on which is more.
Well, in an era of globalization, I do think it's a kind of fundamental question.
But I mean, yes. Let's get into that. But let me just finish this thought that as we figured out how to build larger and larger groups, what happened as a way of doing that was that at the same time we started to shrink our understanding of what a family is, and we started to become more individualist in our understanding of how we live together. So the social developments that allow us to scale up cooperation to a modern level of working together in groups of millions of people has, as a result, institutional changes that at the same time also decrease family size and individualize people. So on the one hand, you grow the sort of human community, right? No. But you do that by by I don't want to say atomizing, but by individualizing the elements of society that
in the West
that are bound up in this structure. Largely it's most pronounced and happened most rapidly in what we refer to as the West, and so Central Western Europe.
I find it interesting that you say that, because you tend to be writing about a lot of empirical research.
Yeah.
But here I think there's a bias in your work, namely that I think it's typically Western.
Biases,
Individualization, I think, is not a modern phenomenon; it's a typical Western phenomenon.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it's a Western phenomenon. I think
that people in China are also individualized.
Yeah, well, there are very, very solid studies on precisely these kinds of differences within East Asian countries, for instance in China.
Yeah.
You see that there's also a spectrum of how individualist and analytic and Western, of course it's not Western because the term isn't so good, but how individualist people are in different places in China, depending also on how society works in these different parts of China. So depending on how much of the economy and social life is organized by kinship structures, that's where people tend to be less individualist.
On the one hand, you say morality is a historical social construction that develops throughout the years. I totally agree. But on the other hand, you do say there is a process of moral modernization that does tend to scaling up and individualizing people.
Yes.
Whatever the context is.
That's not sort of a predetermined end goal that societies are moving towards. It's an evolutionary process, right? So you have these cultural and social variants that emerge, and some turn out to be more stable or more successful or just more powerful. Right, because usually when you build larger societies, you become more powerful also in military terms, and you become just superior, not in any moral sense, but just in terms of the kind of pressure that you can apply in other places. And that happened also a couple thousand years ago, where basically you still had this competition between two different models: early urbanization and early, maybe even civilizations and empires that started to emerge. They were very hierarchically organized and very exploitative and oppressive. And on the other hand, you still had this small scale model. And there was a competition between these two models, and the one model won because it was mightier. Right? Not because it was better. In fact, it was worse, much worse for the majority of people to live in these early city-states, much more pathogen stress, so many more diseases of living more closely together with animals, a much worse diet, much more exposure to droughts and floods and so on and so on. Enormous inequality with a few god kings and 95% of people or more being completely ground up in slavery and hard work and toiling in the fields. So it's just this model turned out to be superior because larger groups tend to be able to absorb or destroy other groups, which is what they did. And this kind of dynamic always repeats itself when you have empires encounter the non-empire people, the barbarians or whoever it is, right?
Yeah.
The Germanic peoples. And that kind of dynamic repeats itself. Usually, the larger model tends to win. So, and that remains true. It tends to be either more stable or more prosperous or more militarily strong, or all of these things, depending on how large you are able to make your cooperative structures. Now, you also had this question about whether there's such a thing as humanity. We're not talking about the species, right? There are human beings, they belong to a biological taxon. Fine. But that doesn't mean that we can organize, that doesn't mean that we can create humanity as a kind of solidarity amongst human beings across boundaries of
human rights,
ethnicity,
universal basic income,
and languages and so on. All the kind of dividing lines that we have, language and origin and tradition and so on and so on and so on. So that is in a way the when we have a very long-term perspective, the defining question of contemporary society is, where do we want to go? What's the next step in our journey going to be? Are we going to pursue the line of trying to create a feeling of solidarity and collective belonging at a human scale, not just at the scale of I'm German, you're French, and so then we're never going to like each other, right? So only going to be at the national level. Will we be able to pull this off at a global level? To a certain extent, the 20th century contained the lesson that it's very risky to double down on solidarity at a national level, because that creates, or at a group level of a certain sort, because that creates, for instance, there is a path towards genocidal activities, of course, when you highlight group differences and group divisions very strongly, and there is a path that is very much focused on military opposition and wars and gaining land and so on and so on and so on.
But I understand.
And I think the 20th century has taught that lesson that's not
I'm unsure.
guaranteed to be a good idea.
No, we have no guarantees in history. So
Of course not. Of course not.
I mean,
Of course not. But what we've learned is that.
Let me say something about.
Wait a second. Let me just finish this. What we've learned is that organizing cooperation at that particular scale, namely national identity, has its own problems. We are now living, for instance, in a Europe that tries to basically de-emphasize this model. Open borders, much more interaction, right? We speak English. I live in Germany. I work in the Netherlands, and so on and so on. It's a very, very non-nationalist understanding of how society is supposed to work, of how
I consider it to be very problematic. Actually, also that you don't speak Dutch.
Well,
by the way.
I don't think it's problematic. I think that is the way, but it's very much an open question whether that's the direction that society wants to go.
I'm unsure. I mean, you can also. I mean, it's also the German trauma, of course. So I understand it that for a German working in the Netherlands, talking English, I mean, that's a different situation. But you could say that the project of nationalization for other countries has been a modern trajectory. So it's not. It's only not the whole focus on alienation on the negative shadow sides of nationality. They are there. It's an ambivalent.
Exactly.
It's an ambivalent construct.
In the 19th century.
So you spoke about the extended mind. It's ambivalent, but the other side of the ambivalence, so the sunny side, so to say, is, for instance, the feeling of identity.
Yes.
So you need the language. The language. Is not only a social construct. Indeed, it's an extended mind in your words. Yeah. So it's kind of a collective. Participation process, a collective love, a collective that loves itself, honors itself, and maybe in the line of your argument, in the end, kinship is not something that you can eternally scale up. So
you can't.
You can in a certain sense, but not in all senses. So maybe there are. I'm not sure whether it are biological, but maybe cultural mechanisms.
That's precisely the point, that kinship is very much not scalable, right? Because relatedness is diluted so quickly that you cannot organize even groups of hundreds of people on the basis of kinship.
Yeah, sorry, I'm using the wrong words. But maybe there are borders to collective identities.
Yes, well, that's the question.
Maybe there are. And that's maybe the scaling up of this eventually is actually dividing people again among other lines. So there's the current identity wars of the Muslims, of the wokies or the anti-wokies on the internet. So it's also maybe a result of collective societies that are borderless. So maybe it's the best, in some sense, the best middle ground, so to say, nation states cooperating in structures like the European Union between mass individualization and at the far end kinship that is that is layered topped with layers of collective identities. But maybe it's actually in between, whereas most
the question
philosophers would say that it's still an estrangement. It's still something that primarily holds us down, the nation state. Maybe it's actually something that still communicates, a membrane that communicates between.
Stepping back, the question is, how do you adjust the optimal size of organizing human cooperation? Because we're very flexible in that, right? There's no one model that we are.
But we have history, so it's not like that. We're not in a store that we can say, a little bit.
But we can live in very small bands and very small tribes and very small family-like groups.
I'm unsure where in modern societies.
Well, there are societies that work like that. hunter-gatherer communities.
Yeah, but those are of course not modern.
But human beings are capable of living like that in general. It's the same kind of being that is capable of living like that. That's one point. And we are capable of living in very, very large structures that consist of millions and even hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we adjust the optimal size of human population, of human group size, for instance, right? Some people, I think a more conservative line would say, would want to emphasize the constraints imposed by our human nature and our psychology on increasing group size. And maybe some people would even say that it may turn out that actually the national level is kind of the optimal compromise between, it's still many people, but it is also possible to have a real sense of belonging and solidarity at that level, right? That's one possibility. But we must also remember that at any point in human history, more conservative-minded people have watched current social events and have said enough is enough, right? So we always see that as a recurrent theme, that there are some people who think that further growth is going to be problematic, further growth is going to be alienating, it's going to make us lose our identities, and it does in some cases. The question is then, are the losses that we incur by moving further along this path of scalability, are the losses that come with that, loss of belonging, of shared culture and so on, which may be real, are they compensated for by larger benefits that make it worth our while? I think again, there's no guarantee that will happen. I think in many cases, we also don't have to decide, because we still do have families, we still do have communities, we still do have cities, and we still do have nations. Well, we do. We do feel like
it's untrue. It's simply not true. We have many sociological reports about this process of individualization, bowling alone. So it's simply untrue. Less and less, fewer people. It's untrue. People identify less with their family. Yeah, more people.
I'm not saying that they identify less with that. I'm saying people still do have families and they identify very strongly.
There's always an emotional and psychological part of this, and the feeling of being lonely. Not establishing a family. It's not only like I'm here kind of 50s conservative that say people will get married.
I know the point. I just don't think it's
a lot of people. Why do you don't think it's true? It's a sociological fact.
There are certain studies. It's true that there is evidence suggesting that certain social upheavals lead to individualizations and social breakdown and social pathologies in certain parts. But it's untrue that in general a functioning model of being a family member, being a community member is absent. That's
of course. I mean, it's indeed the other way around.
Just to see what we disagree about. We are building these extra structures on top of each other. They're not replacing each other, right? It's not like by de-emphasizing the importance of nation states, the Netherlands disappear, right? There is still there's still a less strong but still tangible social identity, for instance, in France, in England, in the Netherlands, in America, and in other places, all over the world. It's de-emphasized and moderated to some extent, which is a price that is being paid by scaling up cooperative structures at any point in history, right? Just like, you know, when all you have in a group of 30 individuals, when all you have is just kinship, moving to a larger group of a couple of hundred individuals, it's gonna loosen those ties a little bit. It's gonna be some loss, it's gonna be some gain. And likewise, we see that de-emphasizing, and I think for good reasons to a large extent, because the 20th century is the horror story of doubling down on national identities. That's, I think, very hard to not take into consideration as a relevant fact that national identities.
Well, we cannot always talk about the Holocaust. So I mean, nationalism.
But I haven't.
You should be able to talk about national identities without the Second World War. It's difficult in Germany, but in the Netherlands, it's a fair position to discuss the fruitfulness of nationalism.
But I don't think that's true.
We can disagree about it.
But immediately after, I don't think I've obsessed about the Holocaust in this conversation.
No.
It's just that we live in that time right now.
Yeah.
And indeed, the Declaration of Universal Human Rights was signed by the vast majority of nations immediately after the Second World War, who did share that insight that if you want to organize a peaceful, thriving society, it is worth articulating what a possible ideal of solidarity about amongst humans in general.
Yeah, of course. So for the last 5 minutes, I want to discuss something different. When I look at the contents of your book, you have these different layers. We only discussed really one layer, but maybe we do another conversation. Maybe you read the book. Huh?
Of course, that's a good idea.
Read the book and we'll invite you again. But one of the things that I noticed is that there's a fastening in your history, so to say. So you start with a very long time ago, and then history fastens.
Yeah.
So there's also a chapter on the last 50 years.
Yeah, last 5 years.
Last 5 years, last 500 years. Maybe a reflection on this, that you can't relativize, you can't say, well, things change, we scale up, but the scaling up of the beginning phase of being a human being went much more slower than the scaling up in the last decades.
Yeah. Not much happens in prehistory.
Yeah,
for long periods of time.
And that's maybe also, ethically speaking, a very difficult thing. So that we think that we scale up and that things improve, but if you look at the discontents in Dutch society, for instance, also in German society, especially in English society, and in France, well, we know about
who knows what they think.
The banlieues, well, you can read their newspapers. And the point I wanted to stress or invite your reflection on it, we have been scaling up very fast. In capitalistic, but also in institutional sense, and also, for instance, relating to that what we lost as a nation state.
Yeah.
So, for instance, we lost in Dutch academia, we lost our own language.
Not entirely, but it's a real dynamic. Yeah,
it's a serious dynamic. I mean, you work in the Netherlands for years. I'm happy that you work here because you do very interesting research, but you don't work in Dutch.
No.
So
no one does. No one does.
No one in academia, indeed. But so academia doesn't take its responsibility for Dutch culture in that sense. With all kinds of arguments, I don't want to go into that.
No,
but the scaling up, universalizing, is going pretty fast. Yeah. So how do you look at this this idea? Is it just a fact of life, or have you any thoughts on it? Because I am concerned about this. So I think that
I get it.
Things can go too fast.
I get it.
That's also the problem with woke. It's not that woke is completely untrue. That the things that they address are some things I do understand. Relating, for instance, to questions of justice between the sexes, I do understand it, but it's the quickness.
I get it. So we have this accelerating pace of social change. You have more people, more stuff happens, right? You have more developments. When humanity consists literally only of a couple of thousand individuals, nothing much happens for millions of years. That's normal, and the more people you have, the more stuff happens, and the more potential for innovation and crisis. So good or bad innovation you have. I think also here you have to fairly tally the costs and benefits. On the one hand, it's true that, for instance, by moving towards a globally or largely globally shared language, for instance, in doing research, you do not or you de-emphasize the contribution that you make to nurturing and continuing Dutch as an intellectual language. That is true. Right? Universities do much less of that in the Netherlands than they used to do. But of course, it could also be a way of discharging the responsibility that universities have towards their own country by being an active and valuable member of this international community of researchers. So again, it's not so simple, I think. There are costs and benefits, and the question is, do the benefits compensate for the costs that we incur? And I think there's also sometimes a matter of taste for what kind of culture boundness would people like to see, and how cosmopolitan or inclusive are people inclined. I tend to lean very much, in fact, towards the more cosmopolitan, inclusive side, but also because that is sort of in my interest.
One final question. You have this. I know you can. We can continue this conversation very long, but I also have the time, so I want to go to this. No, you have this empirical account of ethics. I know you know it very well, of Jonathan Haidt. So he has a moral foundation theory.
Haidt,
Jonathan Haidt. He has this moral foundation theory. So this layeredness seems to be.
Yeah,
he's not. His perspective is not historical; it's psychological, so it has its disadvantages. But there is.
There's an
evolutionary
foundation. There's an evolutionary foundation to these moral foundations. And the idea is that we have basically these. It used to be 5, now it's 6 or perhaps 6 plus. Harm and fairness, purity, community, authority, and liberty. And different people emphasize different aspects of morality more strongly. So you have some people who are sort of like progressive liberals. They're more about fairness and avoiding harm, and they don't care so much about community and maintaining bodily integrity or something like that, right?
And then you have the sanctity, the heiligheid.
Sanctity and purity belong
that's
together.
The word, thank you. So that's the idea that what I want to get at is actually that maybe change, liberty is one moral value. Is one, and there's actually an opposite one of tradition, of continuation. And hate kind of argues that liberal leftist progressive people, they tend to be open-minded. They call themselves inclusive. I'm not sure whether that's the right compliment, but
selectively inclusive.
But other people disagree with it. They have more layers of morality. For instance, this idea of being loyal to tradition, but also to certain rituals. For instance, Santa Claus. Sinterklaas.
It could be church. It could be language. It could be. So
if you read other empirical accounts of what people tend to see as moral, for instance, Swartz, the Israeli guy, also describes these kind of differences. The people that want to change things, that want to scale up, and the people that seem to be satisfied with the current situation. So there is this. This part of morality that is also that also exists. It's not generally recognized in current academic morality, but if I read your book correctly, it is part of where we come from. And it is also part of, in your argument, I would say, part of who we stayed with. So this ultimate layer of kinship is still in us. But sometimes we abstracted from it, but it's still in us.
Exactly. It's still. So evolution doesn't go back to neither biological nor cultural nor social evolution go back to the drawing board. We always build structures on top of older structures, right? We don't reinvent the brain when a new species forms, but we build on structures that already exist. So there's sort of an inherent conservative bias in evolution as well. Is that you have some change, but you always in generating that change, you always draw on stuff that exists, and that applies to society as well. I think sometimes the impression that, for instance, in academia, in moral philosophy, political philosophy, social theory, and so on, that people don't care about community and loyalty and tradition anymore, which is in a sense true, I think is that people emphasize the things that otherwise wouldn't get emphasized, because we are already community bound. We are already focused on tradition. That's where the way we are built. And if you want to have both, you kind of overcorrect your attention in only focusing on progress and change and so on. But that's just because community and belonging and tradition are already given, right? So the one thing needs to be. If you want to get the one thing, you need to override the other thing to some extent, right? But you don't need to override your affection for friends and family. You don't need to make that happen. You already have it, right? So if you want to reap the benefits of modern economic growth, and I think many of us do. In fact, in a certain telling of the story, modern economic growth was invented in, here in the Netherlands, modern trade networks and so on. If we want to reap the benefit, and it's what has made the Netherlands unusually important relative to its size, historically speaking. Everyone knows the Netherlands, right? But it's very small. It's because it's important as a driver of
modernization.
Of modernization, precisely. And making the first attempts at how to organize. Trade and commerce at a global scale.
Free publishing, newspapers,
also in bad
YouTubing.
Ways. Right? Exactly.
That's why I don't use the word capitalism, but modernization.
Modernization and commerce.
What I would like to end with, and then your short thoughts on that. So I think that one of the problems in our symbolic order of academia, institutions, the extended mind, is actually that we overemphasize change, innovation, globalization, human rights. I think we overemphasize it. Your argument is actually, but the rest is taken for granted. So that's not the problem.
Yes.
We have to compensate for it.
Yes.
I fully disagree. So I think that in the symbolic order, we've lost loyalty.
Well,
we've lost tradition.
In the symbolic order, yes, but also the symbolic order isn't that important, right? It's important for us because that's what we trade
discourse.
in. That's what we trade in, right?
Yeah.
We have so people like us, we have self-selected into an environment where the symbolic is treated with utmost reverence. So when all people talk about in academia is progress and inclusion and change, it feels skewed and distorted. Not to me, perhaps, but perhaps to you. And that's fine. Again, I think there is a substantial argument that is also ongoing about what the optimal mix of change and conservation and liberty and tradition is.
Yeah.
Right? And many countries give different answers to that. The US, Israel, Germany, the Netherlands, they all have they come down on different sides of that equation of how to adjust these levers.
Well, the decision makers, the managers, the intellectuals tend to give the same answers. Huh? You know that.
I think that there tends to be a certain convergence in
what they call open-mindedness.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it this polemically. Social groups tend to converge on certain things that are, for the time being, taken for granted in these social groups. Right now, in intellectual and cultural elite groups, a certain type of normative infrastructure is preferred and promoted. I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think
very academic but nice answer. Thanks for that, Hanno.
Yeah.
Final thought. I mean, we're going to read your book.
Yeah.
Final thought.
Please do.
What do we take with? Why do we read the book? I would say, for an historically informed account of what the realm of morality is.
Yeah. I think.
But it's not only history.
It's not only history.
That's a nice ambivalence.
If you're interested in who we are as human beings, and in particular from the angle of what we are as moral human beings, then that book will give you a well-informed and clear and unafraid account of how humanity was formed in those terms as a moral being, and I think I tried to make it fun to read, and people seem to like it.
I liked it. Thanks, Hanno. Make sure you become a member of the New World. Let me know if you liked it, this discussion in English. I hope you enjoyed it, actually, but do let me know. Also, what you think of this historical account of the extended mind and what notions you would use. Thanks, Hanno.
Yeah, thank you.